But now we move to what we call a community moment. This is an opportunity for anybody in the Oasis community to come up and share a short 8 to 10 minute presentation. Maybe it's their journey of how they ended up here at Oasis. Maybe it's a hobby or an interest. We've had them on just about everything. Today we're excited to welcome back the host of the JRR Talking podcast, the host of our Dining Beyond Borders event, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You all know him and love him. Let's welcome Josh Richards.
Good morning. Thanks for stealing my thunder about the Dining Beyond Borders. That will be tomorrow. I'm just going to go ahead and squeeze this announcement right in so I don't have to get back up here. At El Patio, 6444 Westheimer Road. And as Jesse said, the community moment's a really cool format because you can talk about things that are really personal, which I have. One of the last times I got up here, I talked about being a junkie, and we're not going to talk about that again. Or being a minister and being fired. Typically, when I'm not talking about personal things, I either like topics that are really abstract or really absurd. And since my man Dennis here is going to be talking about what my art teacher called Picasso the father of abstract art, I'm going to go full absurd here with you. So just hold on, and I'll try and wrap this up in like 7 minutes. I want to talk to you about the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s, and I'm just going to go ahead and say right now, I'm going to do this a great disservice. I cannot cover so many of the avenues the way I wish I could. So I'm just going to be very brief and say that my big inspiration for this was Kurt Anderson has a fantastic book about American history called Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire. It's a 500-year history, as well as a book by Lawrence Wright, an amazing reporter, called Remembering Satan. Maybe one of these days I can get around to doing my dream talk about why I wear so many shirts with Satan on them, but that is not this talk today. Okay, so another random thought that I promise ties in. It is 72 days until Halloween, which is my favorite holiday. I like the word Halloween because I'll never forget being a young man at First Baptist Church at Deer Park, and I never quite understood why we always had to have a fall festival. Are you counting the days, Jesse? Okay, good. I saw somebody like on their phone. Anyway, okay, so we always had this thing called the Fall Festival. I said, why don't we call it Halloween? And I remember being told, well, that's a satanic thing. We don't say Halloween. We say Fall Festival. And I did some reading, and that's not true. Halloween means All Hallows Eve. It's the day before All Saints Day, November 1st. And I was also happy to inform the people of my church this, which really pissed them off, and I thought that was hilarious. What I did not know was that there's this cultural memory that many people have seemed to forgot, but that some still have, of this satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. Another part, and this ties together, is I'm also fascinated by the Salem witch trials. This really disturbing part of American history where people had these crazed fantasies, and a lot of people just lied, and a lot of people died some really horrible deaths behind that. I read The Crucible in high school, and that's what sparked my fantasy of the Salem witch trials. Also, for one of the readings, as we read it aloud in class, I was Abigail Williams, which was hilarious, but I'll never forget. I even was able to remember the line where she says to John Proctor, "I remember you, John Proctor, when you held me and you sweated like a stallion behind your barn." Anyway, that's the last weird thing I say right now. Before I jump into this, I just want to say one thing. I edited this a lot. I just want to say first and foremost that when anybody says they are a victim of abuse, sexual, physical, or otherwise, believe them. It is important to believe them. I do not want to make light of that. This past week and all that's happened in Pennsylvania is just awful. I don't have any other commentary for you on that terrible situation, but I just wanted to highlight just how important I think that is, and I don't want to make light of that. So, yes. In the 1980s, counselors and psychologists began to triple in numbers. The amount of psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, that sort of thing, they tripled, and this idea, completely contrary to science and reason, came out that people would bury memories that were awful and that they could be recovered. You could remember things. Now, some of the most ridiculous of these memories were alien abductions, usually people in rural areas who all kind of fit a certain profile, but there were other kinds, and the book called The Courage to Heal had begun to encourage people that if they had certain psychological problems, or if they even in their heart at all felt that they were a victim of sexual abuse, even if they didn't remember who did it, or when, or if it had happened, that it probably did, which is an incredibly dangerous idea, because some people happen to be incredibly suggestible. Also, therapists began to study how to recover these repressed memories. Unsurprisingly, people began to describe things that weren't just sexual abuses or abductions. They began to describe past lives. Usually, these would be therapy sessions that would be guided by a counselor, and the most frequent patients to do this were those who, when further scrutinized, were incredibly suggestible and prone to fantasies. Rigorous cognitive scientists say these claims are completely false. Richard McNally, Ulrich Neisser, and one of my favorite writers, Daniel Dennett, all say that repressed memories, that's not a thing. No evidence for it whatsoever. Never once has there been a documented case of somebody who's experienced something traumatic, they've repressed it, and it's come back. All of the evidence seems to show that when something terrible happens to you, you remember it all the more. You don't repress it and remember it later. So, moving along, there were still they were psychologists who said to these scientists, science be damned, if people feel this in their hearts, it's true. And with the rise of the moral majority, Pat Robertson, fundamentalist Christianity, and its firm belief in an active and real Satan began to flood the ideologies of America. The idea that satanic cults were sexually abusing, sacrificing, and grooming children for Satan's service began to rise, and a lot of this is owed to a woman named Michelle Smith and her therapist, Lawrence Pasner. Through hypnosis, Pasner was able to help Michelle Smith remember that she was locked in a cage by her mother for days on end, witnessed the brutal killing of kittens, seeing Satan himself and being wrapped in his tail, and having been tortured and harmed by Satan, but also healed by the Virgin Mary, the Archangel Michael, and Jesus himself. Oddly enough, while she was being locked in a cage for days on end, she never missed a day of school and had perfect attendance. Later on, Michelle Smith went on to marry her therapist, Lawrence Pasner, and they wrote a book, a best-selling book called Michelle Remembers. It was sold in the millions and marketed as nonfiction. After this, innumerable Americans began to tell stories that followed the same template, almost exactly. More victims of ritual or satanic ritual abuse came forward in hundreds and thousands. A moral panic ensued. In 1973, a book that became a movie called Sybil further took this idea that repressed memories could push somebody to create these multiple identities. Sybil herself having dozens, maybe even hundreds. And the DSM-4 shortly included multiple personality disorder in its fourth edition. While up until 1973, there were maybe 273 known or alleged cases of multiple identity disorder, that number jumped to 183,000 within 3 years. Here's what that has to do with Satan. Sybil, first of all, she later recanted, saying she made all this up. She was given sedatives, she was hypnotized, and she said, I just made all that up. These therapy sessions kind of led me there. Lawrence Pasner, who I just mentioned, he reemerged at a meeting of psychiatrists and psychologists and decided that the great cause of all this was Satan. He was behind it. Like communist cells in the 1950s, Satan was leading cells all throughout America. Like the communists, Satan was just there, infecting the world. Candace Burgess, who was under her doctor's care, is another one of these sad victims who, after being given the book Michelle Remembers, she certainly remembered her parents inducting her into a cult where they witnessed cannibalism and further sacrifices. After admitting these memories, her children were taken from her and placed in mental hospitals. Their lives were ruined. For years they were there, all because of this remembered memory. Shortly after these stories were made famous, ABC, 2020, and Geraldo Rivera, Geraldo actually had two, all had specials. The one with Geraldo Rivera had 1/3 of all people in America watching TV, watching on a Friday night as he began to tell the world about the Satanic Panic, that Satan is real and he's influencing these horrible crimes. He brought on Ozzy Osbourne and accused him of infecting the world with Satanism, to which some bands and even Ozzy himself said, "This is a great way to make some cash. Let's monetize this." And I can't blame him for that. I mean, it's never a bad idea to make a quick buck. Well, sometimes it is, but later. Okay, so wrapping this all up, Geraldo says that Satan existing may be a matter of belief, but Satanism is a matter of fact. He claimed that there were 3 million Satanists in just this country who are amidst us in their secret cults trying to kill, abuse, and defile children. Crimes that eluded law enforcement were shortly after that blamed on Satanists. Doubtlessly, there have been lunatics who have done terrible things and said the devil made me do it, but unprecedented numbers of crimes were pinned on these evil Satanists. Austin, Texas usually had about 50 murders a year at its height. Yet Austin PD estimated that over 50,000 children a year in America were being killed in these satanic crimes. Very, very few bodies were there to support any of these claims. Yet that was what they believed. Law enforcement, the FBI, PDs all over America began to have classes on how to spot satanic ritual abuse. And I want to wrap this up just talking about 3 quick cases. I took out a lot of the first one just because of all this stuff in Pennsylvania, but the McMartin preschool. These poor children were interviewed sometimes upwards of 30 times until therapists and law enforcement officers got the answers they wanted. 3 different people spent over a decade of their lives in prison for crimes they didn't commit, for abuses they didn't commit, for children who were led. I'm not saying these are children who made claims and then they went somewhere else with it. These seem to be children these are all children who recanted later and said, "We were pushed to say this." After around 30 interviews, you'll say anything to get someone off your back, especially if you're a child. In Olympia, Washington, a sheriff's deputy named Paul Ingram, his daughter had a repressed memory that her father was involved in a satanic cult, that he had murdered people in front of her, that he had sacrificed animals to Satan, that she saw Lucifer herself. She did not. And they were able to kind of tie some unsolved murders, and they, in an effort to try and solve them, all of this hysteria about Satan somehow led to Mr. Ingram. Being a Pentecostal, his pastor came and they prayed fervently that Satan would not influence this investigation or him. He was hypnotized and then promptly confessed and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Not for a crime he committed, but for a crime he remembered that never happened. Terrible. DNA evidence later had him acquitted of this. And then, of course, and I'll just make passing reference to this, I think most people are familiar with the story of the West Memphis Three kids who wear Satan shirts kind of like me. Maybe they had a little bit longer hair, some oddballs, had these terrible, brutal crimes put on them. And just for having one of them a Motley Crue shirt, one of them with some Wiccan symbols on his journal, they had these horrible crimes pinned on them. They spent years of their lives, decades in prison. Damien Eccles was sentenced to death. He did not die, and they were all eventually let out. And the greatest horror of all that is that they were let out on an Alford plea, which means, hey, you're not going to be able to sue the state. It means you're not guilty, but you're not guilty, but we'll let you out of prison if you sign this, which is horrible. And so I'm just going to say this, and this will be my last point, and I'm going to get up, or get off the mic, that Satan gets a bum rap. I would love one day to do a talk about Satan in the Bible, where that idea comes from. I, as a Bible nerd, I'm fascinated by it. I'm not going to do that right now. But I will say this, that Satan does get a bum rap. Yeah, I wear the Satan shirts, and most of them are shirts I buy from the Satanic Temple. Any money you give them goes to supporting women's rights, women's reproductive rights, and some really wonderful causes. Here are the tenets. There are two main forms of Satanism in this country. There's the Anton LaVey school, which says, don't harm people. I'm not very fond of it because he's kind of a jerk. But Lucian Greaves and his Satan group is this. They say they're nothing more than a humanist group. Their tenets are as follows. One should strive to be compassionate and show empathy towards all creatures in accordance with reason. The struggle for justice is ongoing and necessary if justice will prevail over laws and institutions. One's body is inviolable and subject to one's will alone. The freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego one's own. Beliefs should conform to our best scientific understanding of the world. We should take care not to distort scientific facts to fit our beliefs. People are fallible. If we make mistakes, we should do our best to rectify and remediate any harm that may have been caused. Every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written and spoken word. I have tried to gloss over a huge part of American history, and I've done a great disservice to it, but I hope you guys will check some of this out. Again, Kurt Anderson has a great book on this, and Lawrence Wright has a wonderful one, Remembering Satan. Cases like these answered the question I used to have as a young high schooler, that could Salem happen again? It could, and it has, and it might happen again. All the more should this inspire us to remember that reality is known through reason, and that critical thought is the most important thing we can cherish as human beings. Also, Satan's not that bad. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Josh.